During this lesson, one of the students asks our teacher, "You told us that it is good to know 2,000 words. Where can I find these 2,000 words that are the most important for me to learn?" My teacher replies, "You can Google a list of the 2,000 most frequent words in English, but such a list will not help you much. When you start to learn words from this list, you will learn words outside the context. You will learn words that are not connected with any story. You will not learn what other words are connected with these words in sentences. You will learn them in your short-term memory. This system works only for some words. These are basic words which describe things and people around us. For example, mother, father, apple, blue, orange, dog, cat, book, car, house, city, boy, girl, water, cinema, or paper. These are words which represent something that you can imagine easily. For example, when you learn the word dog, you know immediately what it is. You have a clear idea in your head of what the word means. Yet, when you want to learn words such as appreciate or suppose, this system doesn't work well. This is a problem many students experience. They start their studying by using lists of words. It works at the beginning, and they believe that they can learn English this way. They don't know that when they achieve the level of 1,000 words, they have to start using a different system. If you want to learn words from a higher level, you have to learn them from whole sentences. If you understand the meaning of a word and the context of a sentence, you will learn the word much better. You can learn words from lists, but there is usually a limit to where you can go with this way of learning, and it is 1,000 words. Also, this way of learning is very slow. There are much better ways which we have already spoken about, such as reading. For beginners, the best book I know of for learning new words is For Beginners. There is also one interesting rule that applies here. Every word that is important for you will come back into your life again and again until you learn the word. This is very similar to the way we learn our own language when we are children. We don't study from lists of words. We just use the language, and important words keep coming into our lives again and again, until one day we know what the words mean. We keep learning new words this way all our lives. For example, the verb Google is a new word in many languages. We learned this word by using the language. We didn't learn this word from any list of words. When you heard the word Google for the first time, you probably didn't know what the word meant. Then you heard it again and again, as the word was important for you, and after some time, you understood the word. You can forget about lists of words. Learn new words by reading stories and other interesting texts. When you use English a lot every day, you will learn new words more effectively than from lists of words. Does it make sense? Yes, the student replies. Thank you. After school, I go to work. I already know how to do my job very well. Things start to become automatic. I'm glad that I understand my customers. It's not difficult because the conversations are typically very similar. Our customers want coffee or sandwiches, so the words are typically the same or very similar. My confidence grows, and I occasionally start to have longer conversations with our customers. Everything is fine, but then something happens. It is a little shocking to me. When learning a new word, remember it as part of a complete sentence. Something interesting happens to me at work. On Tuesdays, 2 customers visit our cafe. They are husband and wife. The man begins to speak with me. I know he speaks English, but I can't understand him. I do not understand what he wants. I believe he wants something we don't have. So I call my boss. She talks to the man and sells him 2 coffees and 2 of our regular sandwiches. I'm surprised. When they leave, I go to my boss and apologize for not understanding the man. She says it is fine. According to her, this can happen when people speak with an unfamiliar accent. She tells me that they were from Scotland. The next day, I go to school and tell my teacher this story. I tell her that I felt stupid because I didn't understand our customer. I was unsure if my English was adequate for my job. I started doubting myself. My boss was fine with it, but I still needed help from my teacher. I wanted to know what I could do in these circumstances. My teacher says, I understand. You are used to the English that people speak in London, but you aren't used to the Scottish accent. Your ears aren't used to listening to the Scottish accent. You need to train your ears to this accent as well. What happened to you can happen to anyone. When you already speak English at some level and go to a country where people speak with a different accent, you shouldn't be. I follow up with, so what can I do to understand the Scottish accent? I don't live in Scotland. Our teacher advises, you can watch films with Scottish English, or you can watch situation comedies from Scotland, and soon you will understand. I tell her, thank you. After school, I return to my work. Around 5 o'clock, 2 interesting customers enter our cafe. This time they are not Scottish, but rather foreigners. They want to purchase some coffee. They are 2 ladies, and their English is clearly basic. My boss is serving them. When she learns that they do not speak English well, she does something very interesting. She alters her English. She uses very simple sentences of 3 or 4 words. I see that the ladies understand her. They purchase 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches, and 2 cakes. They're happy, and so is my boss. When the ladies leave, I compliment my boss on how she changed her English so that the 2 ladies could understand her. My boss claims that she sometimes has to speak in very simple English. It makes no difference whether the customers can speak English well or not. They are our customers, and we must do everything possible to ensure their comfort. If they see that they can speak English here, they are welcome to visit our cafe every day. I believe that our boss is a good businesswoman. She goes above and beyond to ensure that our customers are satisfied. It is true that we have a large number of customers. Our cafe is always busy. When you want to understand people with a unique accent, spend some time listening to audio with their accent. The next day at school, I tell my teacher about my interaction with my boss and the two ladies who did not speak English well. Our teacher says, "Great. Your boss must be a very clever young lady. It is true that you can communicate with everybody. Even people who speak English very well can have a conversation with those who are just at the beginning of their journey. Today, we will speak about different levels of English and what you should be able to do at these levels. Let's start with the lowest level of 1,000 words. At this level, students can speak about some basic things from everyday life. The speaking is very limited, but it is already possible to communicate slowly for a short time with people who want to speak with you. Your sentences are short. They usually have 4 words. If the others also speak in short sentences, you can have a basic conversation. When students move to a higher level, which is 2,000 words, the conversations are easier and the sentences are longer. This is the level most of you in this class are at right now. You should be able to speak about many things from your life. You can speak about your family, hobbies, job, and traveling. Sometimes you may have a problem when you want to go into a deeper conversation on certain topics. However, this level is usually efficient enough for everyday use of English. If you want to be able to have a deeper conversation on many topics, it is good to know 2,000 words. Your goal, as a student of English who wants to be able to speak English well, should be to learn 2,000 words. Of course, you can learn more than 2,000 words. The more words you know, the easier it will be for you to communicate in English. But 2,000 words is the level that is usually enough for communicating in English about almost everything. I think that the two ladies at your cafe knew about 1,000 words. Your boss went to their level and had a basic conversation. She speaks with the man and sells him 2 coffees and 2 of our regular sandwiches. I am surprised. When they leave, I go to my boss and tell her that I am sorry I didn't understand the man. She says that it is okay with them. After school, I go to my work. The two ladies come to our cafe again. They also bring 2 of their friends. It is my turn to serve them. I speak to them in simple, short sentences. They understand me. This is great. They tell me that they are tourists from Japan. They tell me that they like our cafe because people understand them here. When you want to be able to communicate in English, learn 2,000 words. On Thursday, I return to school, and one student asks a very interesting question. I am very shy when I have to speak English. Can you help me overcome my shyness? Our teacher says, it is natural to feel uncertain or shy when speaking in a foreign language. We're doing something we're not perfect at. The chances of making a mistake are high. I was also very shy when I was learning foreign languages. I remember how afraid I was to make a mistake. When I made a mistake, I felt stupid and occasionally blushed. Now things are different. I use languages to communicate. I only care about communication. You know, I'm currently learning Spanish. Embarrassing situations can arise, but they cannot prevent me from speaking Spanish. It's true that I still feel shy when I have to speak Spanish. I also blush on occasion, but it doesn't bother me. It is a normal human emotion that never lasts forever. I continue to use Spanish because I know that it is the only way I can improve. I try to see things as they are. I am a student who is working on improving my Spanish skills. It is impossible to skip multiple levels in one day. A beginner cannot become a perfect speaker in 1 hour. I also understand what I mean to those around me when I already speak some Spanish. I am valuable to those who speak it. You should observe the same. When you already speak some English, you can communicate with others in English. That's great. Look at what you already know. You know 2,000 words. You've already gone from 0 to 2,000 words. I appreciate it. Some students believe that knowing English entails being able to speak like a native speaker, having perfect pronunciation and grammar, and simply speaking without making any mistakes. They believe that if they don't do that, they don't know English. They feel embarrassed because they are not perfect. These students are extremely hard on themselves, but it's not necessary. All of you are fantastic because you already speak some English. Continue working on your English and your shyness will gradually fade. I like what our teacher tells us. I am also sometimes shy. I know that I should practice speaking a lot, but in some situations I don't want to look stupid, so I don't speak as much as I should. I decide to be a little braver in these situations and use them to practice more. I hope you're doing all right today, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Okay, so you know that there's a wide variety of accents in the UK, not to mention the accents that you will find in other English-speaking countries like Ireland, Canada, the USA, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and more. So obviously there are accents that we associate with these different countries, but also, within each country, there are many different accents too. Particularly in the UK, English is a hugely diverse language, and in my experience, foreign learners of English don't usually know a lot about the different accents, particularly all the regional varieties in the UK. And they often just find it difficult to understand those different varieties. As a result, learners of English can't enjoy the great variety of sounds in English, the sheer diversity of character and personality that you get from the different varieties of English. Therefore, it's worth taking the time to talk about it on this podcast. You know, my general experience or my general opinion on this subject is that if you, as a learner of English, are familiar with lots of accents, if you're able to understand lots of different versions of English, then your English will be that much stronger as a result. So, this is such a big subject that to do it justice would require me to write a whole book about it, and many people have. For example, David Crystal and Ben Crystal wrote a book called You Say Potato, which is a really great book. I've been listening to the audiobook version of it, and I listen to it again and again because it's full of useful information and stuff. You Say Potato by David Crystal, and Ben Crystal is an example of a big, thick book that covers the whole subject of accents. So, it's a big subject worthy of a whole book's worth of commentary. I'm not writing a whole book about it. Instead, I just do episodes about accents fairly regularly on this podcast in an effort to cover as much of the topic as possible. For example, I recently did some episodes about British accents that you hear in the Lord of the Rings films. I did 2 episodes about British accents in the Lord of the Rings, which gave me a chance to talk about the different associations that we have with different accents in the UK, and how those associations were used to provide some color and character to the movie versions of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings stories. I also did episodes recently about accents that you might hear in Glasgow, and I spoke to Korean Billy about his videos on regional accents and dialects as well. Okay, so since uploading those episodes, I've noticed a few comments from listeners wondering why there are so many accents in the UK. So, I've had a few comments from people saying, "This is interesting. How come there are so many different accents, considering the UK is quite a small country? We do have a lot of diversity, so why is that?" In order to try and answer that question, I've prepared this episode, which I hope will help you understand the whole thing a little bit more. So, the plan in this episode, or possibly episodes depending on how long this takes, the plan is to talk about these things, okay? So, I'm going to talk about why there are so many accents in the UK, how accents develop as part of a natural psychological process, what this means for learners of English and for teachers of English as well. And also, we'll listen to someone speaking in a Liverpool accent, and I'll help you to understand it. Right. So we'll listen to a sample of some speech in a Liverpool accent, which is going to illustrate some of the things I'm saying, and I'll help you to understand that too. So, we're talking about accents, but also listening to accents too, in this case, a Liverpool accent. So, this episode is about the way that people speak, but it's also about history, psychology, how to learn English, what my friends sound like, and how to understand a football player from Liverpool. So how are all of these things connected? Well, listen on, and you'll find out. Let's start, first of all, with the question of why we have so many accents in the UK. And this is related to something called communication accommodation theory. Okay, now, one of the things I said in those episodes about The Lord of the Rings was that there is a very wide variety of accents in the UK, all right, and that your accent reveals lots of things about you, such as where in the country you're from, and what social background you come from. So, for example, when I meet someone from the UK and they speak to me, immediately, I don't even do it consciously often, it's just subconscious. You pick up on the accent, and that starts to inform the way you understand that person. Okay, we do sort of judge each. We judge each other, even subconsciously, based on the way we speak. Okay, we shouldn't really make assumptions about people based on the way they speak, but we do. The way people speak often is an indicator of things like their social background and, obviously, which part of the country they come from. But it's not just geography. It's also about social background. An accent can reveal quite a lot about that. Remember, when I say accent, this simply means the way you pronounce the words that you're using. If you remember from a recent episode, one of the things I mentioned was this quote from George Bernard Shaw, a writer. And the quote said, "It's impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him." That's a quote I read out before, which is basically a way of illustrating that English people judge each other based on the way they speak. For example, if someone speaks in a very posh, upper-class voice, some people might think, "Oh, bloody posh idiot," or something. Or if someone speaks with a very strong local accent, other people might immediately assume that they're working class or uneducated. So we do make these assumptions about each other, unfortunately. Now that quote from Bernard Shaw, "It's impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him," gives the impression that we all hate each other, doesn't it? It sounds like we all, one person speaks, and everyone's just despising them. It sounds like we all hate each other. I don't really agree that that's the case. The point being made by that quote is that we just have prejudices about each other's accents, and this is probably an expression of the class system in the UK, a class system that arguably still exists in the UK. For example, middle-class people probably look down on people with strong regional accents, and maybe even resent people who speak with very posh accents, and so on. There's a certain level of judgment that goes on, right? That's what that suggests. Now here's a comment from an Indian listener not long ago, from a listener called Nick, who is a regular commenter in the comments section. Hello, Nick. So, this is what Nick wrote. Nick wrote in response to one of the episodes about accents. He said, "What a complicated life there in the UK. Everyone resents each other because of their accents. Now, we don't really resent each other, but we do judge each other a bit. But, we also love each other's accents as well." Nick goes on to say, "Wow, I never thought that in the UK, accents had such an important role in people's lives." And yes, it's true, Nick. Accents are fairly important indicators of our identity, but they're also a source of great fun, joy, amusement, and celebration. Nick says, "Mark, thanks for this episode. You opened up the UK in a new way for me." Even though I knew about different accents in the UK, and from your podcast as well, I somehow didn't realize the deep meaning of accents in English life. Nick continues, saying, but I don't really understand how it happened that you have so many accents in quite a small area. I can understand that different levels of society may have different words in their vocabulary, but why should they have such different accents, especially when they live in one city or region? Maybe it was people's desire to make something with the language, or at least with pronunciation, in order to somehow be unique from others. Like, for example, different groups of people or subcultures dress in certain clothes, or different nations have their own folk costumes to mark them out as being different. Maybe it's that. And again it continues. But that's the end of Nick's comment. So, he's basically saying, how come there's such diversity? Maybe it's like the way social groups dress differently as a way of expressing their group identity. Maybe it's that. Well, Nick, I think this is a really good question, and there are so many interesting aspects to the answer. I'm now going to try and deal with that question. Okay, so why do we have so many accents in the UK? And if you don't believe me, just check out some of the videos on YouTube, like, 30 British accents, or some of the different videos where one person goes through all the different accents. For example, I can do a quick version of it now. Like, for example, let's say I'm going to say, would you like a cup of tea? Sit down. Would you like a cup of tea? How are you? Sit down. Would you like a cup of tea? Right, in my voice. Sit down. How are you? Would you like a cup of tea? In a sort of Cockney voice. Sit down. How are you? Do you want a cup of tea? Do you want a nice cup of tea? Sit down. That was a bit crap, wasn't it? Sit down. Would you like some tea? All right, my love, all right, mate. How's it going? How are you? Do you want a cup of tea? Liverpool. Always, do you want some tea? Do you want a cup of tea? Come round to my house. I'll make you some tea. We'll sit down and play some PlayStation, for example. Manchester. All right, mate. How's it going? Do you want some tea? Do you want a cup of tea, mate? All right. Newcastle. Do you want a cup of tea, man? Do you want a cup of tea? I mean, these might all sound the same to you because, as I said, you're not familiar with them, but anyway, that's just a little sample of different accents. All right, so how come we have so many accents? Now, this could be explained by something called communication accommodation theory, or CAT for short. This could be explained by a cat, okay? I could just get a cat to come, hey, cat, come on, Whiskers. I don't actually have a cat here who's going to explain it, but that would be good, to be honest. That would be really good if a cat, like literally a cat, came in and just explained it all to you. That would be amazing, right? That would be the best podcast or best YouTube video ever. Unfortunately, I don't have a cat to explain the accent phenomenon, but I do have a theory called communication accommodation theory, or CAT for short. Now, accommodation, let's just take out the word accommodation, because you probably already know the word accommodation. You're thinking like hotels, apartments, places to stay. Like when you go on holiday, you need to book your accommodation. That's one meaning of the word accommodation. There is another meaning, too. If we look at the Collins Dictionary online, you'll see that they define, in the third definition, accommodation as a kind of agreement between different people which enables them to exist together without trouble. So, an agreement, not a written agreement like a contract, but a social or psychological tendency for people to come closer to each other and form communities based on shared behavior. That's accommodation in the sense that people are kind of acting or behaving or communicating in similar ways as an expression of their community, right? Accommodation. People accommodate to each other, meaning that they sort of come closer and form communities. If we look at the Wikipedia page for communication accommodation theory, it says that communication accommodation theory is a theory of communication developed by Howard Giles. Howard Giles is a professor of linguistics, I think. Let me just check to make sure that I'm saying the right things about Howard Giles. Howard Giles is a British-born professor of communication at the Department of Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in the United States of America. A British professor who works in America. He came up with the idea of communication accommodation theory. This theory argues that when people interact, they adjust their speech, vocal patterns, and gestures to accommodate others. This theory explores the various reasons why individuals emphasize or minimize the social differences between themselves and the people they're talking to through verbal and nonverbal communication. This theory is concerned with the links between language, context, and identity. It focuses on both intergroup and interpersonal factors that lead to accommodation, as well as the ways that power, macro and micro context concerns affect communication behaviors. In communication accommodation theory, we're talking about two processes: convergence, which is when people come closer together, and divergence, which is when people emphasize the differences between themselves and others. All right, it's all getting a bit academic, isn't it? What the hell are we talking about here? Okay, let's start with just accommodation. It's the process by which people change the way they speak and communicate to express the fact that they are part of a community. For example, when I lived in Japan, because I lived in Japan for a couple of years, my body language changed a little bit over time because I started to accommodate to the cultural context. I started to accommodate to the Japanese people I was talking to every day. So, I'd start to accommodate to that. Now, I didn't really learn Japanese very well, so it's hard for me to say that my Japanese accent became really authentic or anything. But a small example would be how my body language changed. I mean, yeah, all right, the way my body language changed. For example, I found that when I was talking to people, I would assume more Japanese-style body language, which would mean not making as much eye contact as I would in Europe, for example. Maybe nodding or bowing a lot more and using certain hand gestures that they might use in Japan to mean sorry or whatever. I'd accommodated, not even consciously, just subconsciously, because I accommodated to the context in Japan. All right, So that's an example of nonverbal communication accommodation, but also it works in our speech patterns as well. For example, when I lived in Japan, I used to work with a group of Australian people. They were other teachers in the school where I worked, and they were Australian. So I spent a lot of time hanging around, working, and socializing with this group of Australian guys. My speech patterns started to accommodate to Australian. I didn't develop a full-on Australian accent or anything. I didn't become Aussie, but just certain things the typical example in Australia is the rising intonation. You know, that's rising intonation, when your voice sort of goes up at the end, like that at the end of sentences. Now, obviously, Australian people don't do that all the time, but they do it a little bit more than, my friends back home in England. Kind of going up at the end of a sentence. "G'day, mate. Here you go. Oh, you're teaching this class, okay?" For example. But anyway, rising intonation. So, I came back from Japan after having spent time with Japanese and Australian people, nodding and going up at the end of sentences. Basically, there's just two examples of how my communication accommodated to the people I was with. Now imagine that sort of thing. Imagine that process, but taking place throughout someone's life. Taking place over generations as well, to the point at which whole communities of people are communicating and behaving in similar ways as an expression of the fact that they belong to that community. That gives you an idea of how this process can lead to specific accents being formed in certain areas. For example, if you live in Liverpool, you're going to converge with the other people in Liverpool as an expression of the fact that you belong to that community, and you're going to diverge probably from people in Manchester, let's say. Manchester is another big city, not far from Liverpool, but if you're in Liverpool, you'll be proudly Liverpudlian, and you might support one of the Liverpool football teams, and you will associate yourself with Liverpool, not with Manchester. You probably won't like Manchester United, and there are many factors like that, which cause you to behave and act in a way that is the same as the group of people you associate with. And that includes speaking in the Liverpool accent that your parents have, and that the other people in your town have. Okay, so communication accommodation theory suggests that the way we communicate is an expression of our desire or our natural tendency to become part of a social group. Scott Thornberry, a well-known English teacher and writer, has written lots of really good books about English teaching, and he's kind of a legend in the world of English teaching. Scott Thornberry also wrote a blog article about this, and I'm kind of reading from this as well, or quoting from it. So, this whole thing of communication accommodation theory could explain why there are so many different accents associated with different regions in the UK. For example, why people in Liverpool speak differently from people in Manchester, or why the Cockney dialect or Cockney accent came about. Now, I'll speak more about that in a moment. It could also explain why we naturally change the way that we speak, depending on the people around us. It could explain why speaking to a diverse range of people and socializing and actually speaking and communicating to a diverse range of people is very good for your accent, and it could explain why native English speakers sometimes change the way that they speak when talking to foreigners. For example, when traveling or meeting a foreign person, sometimes you find that native English speakers adapt the way they speak without even realizing they're doing it to accommodate the people they're speaking to. And that might explain why, for example, your English teacher might not be speaking completely naturally to you in a classroom situation. Sometimes, not all teachers, but sometimes the tendency is to unconsciously adapt your communication style to the people you're talking to. So, now I'm going to try and deal with these things. I'm going to try and talk about them in a bit more depth. Okay, but not necessarily in the order that I've just given you. Let's talk about this thing, about why native speakers sometimes adapt their language when talking to foreigners. Now, according to Scott Thornberry, the published author of English teaching books, there are two versions, two ways, in which native speakers accommodate non-native speakers when they're talking to them. There are two versions. He says there's caretaker talk and foreigner talk. So these are two different things, caretaker talk and foreigner talk. And this is what he says. He says, quote, "This is especially obvious in the way that we talk to children and non-native speakers, using forms of talk called caretaker talk and foreigner talk, respectively. Both varieties are characterized by considerable simplification, although there are significant differences. Caretaker talk is often pitched higher and slower than talk used with adults. So, caretaker talk is the way that adults might talk to children." Are you all right? Do you know which class you're going to? Oh, look at that. That's a nice t-shirt. What's that? You know, the way that adults talk to children sometimes. For some reason, when adults talk to children, their voice goes up like that. Oh, that's a nice drawing. Aren't you clever? You know, if you spoke like that to an adult, they would think you were an idiot, right? If I spoke like that to one of my adult learners of English, like, "Oh, look at those sentences, aren't you clever?" they'd hate me, right? It would be awful. So anyway, caretaker talk is speaking to children and adapting to them. Then he says, "This is a simpler version of English, but it's nearly always grammatically well-formed. But then there's foreigner talk, and that actually tolerates greater use of non-grammatical, pigeon-like forms. That's the sort of English that English tourists use when they go to other countries. Like, okay, me wait. You hear? Okay, you like? You take me, my wife, to market. You know, that kind of thing. You like drink? No. That's foreigner talk. Now, I've actually seen this kind of thing happening a little bit to some English teachers, and this is one of the things that English teachers have to be careful of. That they don't adapt their speech too much. That they don't start using foreigner talk, because then they're presenting, you know, a grammatically unsound version of English. I have seen and heard English teachers doing that sometimes. I remember, for example, when I worked in Japan, I overheard a few teachers who were, not very experienced, not so qualified, because there are so many teachers out there who weren't really fully qualified, to be honest. I remember hearing quite a lot of foreigner talk there. I mean, it's easy for the learners to understand, but it's not necessarily the most accurate form of English. So, I have seen this happening, where some teachers adapt their speech to the students, speaking this weird form of English that's easy for foreigners to understand, but might not be helping them to learn, depending on the level, I suppose. Anyway, it's difficult to judge it correctly as a teacher, because sometimes you do have to grade your English when you're talking to low-level learners of English. But how much do you grade your language, and how do you do it? This is an important question for English teachers. It's important to speak correctly to learners of English, meaning using the full natural English that you would normally use, and in the same way that most native speakers talk to each other. It's important to do that, but you've also got to make sure that it's comprehensible, that it's easy for the learners to understand. If you're too natural, your low-level students won't understand you, and they won't really learn. Whereas, if you simplify your English too much, then you end up doing this kind of foreigner talk, which is not really a good model of the language. So, I guess this is all part of being a good teacher, knowing how to strike the balance between being comprehensible and yet also being realistic and natural as well. Personally, I always try to keep those things in mind when I speak, and it's probably why my voice becomes more and more like standard received pronunciation. Okay? Because I think generally what happens when I'm speaking on the podcast or when I'm speaking at work is that I do try to speak as naturally as possible, but probably I end up speaking kind of clearly, like I'm trying to pronounce words really, really clearly, and that's how I end up speaking this kind of BBC English sometimes. But I'm always consciously trying to keep it as natural as possible. Okay, but I'm, certainly not doing foreigner talk. Oh God, no. Now, okay, so do I accommodate my English when I talk to native speakers with different accents? What about that question? For example, if I'm speaking to people from certain parts of the country, do I accommodate when I'm talking to them? Well, yes, I do, probably a little bit. I mean, I do accommodate to different accents, but I think that's only when those accents are sort of part of my identity, somehow. For example, I've, spent time growing up in London. I spent time growing up in the Midlands near Birmingham, and so, those accents are sort of in me a little bit. So, excuse me, when I'm talking to people from those areas, then, yeah, I probably do adapt my English a little bit and accommodate to those accents. They're not radical changes because I'm still being myself. But my speech does change a little bit depending on who I'm with. For example, when I'm back in Birmingham, my speech becomes a little bit more brummy. When I'm in London, it does the same. It becomes a bit more London, but only a little bit, of course, and this is completely normal. But when I'm speaking on the podcast, I do just try and make sure I'm speaking really naturally, clearly, and normally, probably with more influence from my London background than the Birmingham one, just because I spent more time living in London than in Birmingham. In terms of the podcast, it's very important for me to speak to other people on the podcast, like to have guests and speak to guests as well, because it's in the interaction with other people that language really becomes most alive and natural. When I'm talking to you on my own, I speak in my neutral voice, but when I'm in conversation with others, you might hear my voice changing slightly, just as I accommodate to the people I'm talking to. You might not even notice, to be honest, because it's often a pretty mild change. Perhaps it doesn't happen that much because I'm still aware that I'm being listened to by my audience. But if you want to check it out, if you want to decide for yourself whether I adapt my speech when I'm speaking to guests versus when I speak to my audience on my own, like this, you could check out some of the episodes in the archive. For example, you could check out the ones where I spoke about my struggle for learning. My accent didn't really change that much, but maybe if I'd spent the weekend in London just hanging out and talking, my accent might have changed a little bit more. I'm now going to avoid mentioning the same thing about when I worked with Australian people. I did pick up some of the accent from them because I spent a lot more time with them than just an hour on a podcast. Certainly when I'm back in Birmingham, my accent changes a bit, because that's where I spent a lot of time when I was younger. For example, I might say, "All right, mate, how's it going? All right, yeah, do you want a drink? Do you want a pint? Come on, let's go to the pub." You know, you might not have noticed that, but okay, here's me doing it in London. "All right, mate, yeah, do you want a pint? Come on, let's go down the pub." That's London. And then when I'm in Birmingham, it might be like, "All right, mate, how's it going? You all right? Do you want to go for a drink? Come on, let's go down the pub." Okay, slight difference. Another question recently was from a listener called Cat. That's not an actual cat. I don't have any cats listening to the podcast. Well, I probably have some cats listening to the podcast, but I don't think they're commenting. I don't know if cats can do that. Anyway, I'm pretty sure they can't. Ridiculous anyway. Cat's question. Cat is one of the listeners who often leaves comments. Hello, Cat. Cat's question is, what are Paul and Amber's accents? Paul and Amber are friends of mine who are on this podcast quite a lot. Actually, I think we've answered this question in a recent episode. Basically, Amber and I think it's like this. Amber and I are pretty similar. The way that we speak is basically received pronunciation. Paul also speaks received pronunciation, but with a bit more of a local influence. I think he's from Kent, which is a county near London, so he speaks with some traces of a Kentish accent. For example, glottal stops are pronouncing T sounds, so I'd say native speaker. Paul might say knive speaker. I say excited. Paul might say excide. Also, some of the TH sounds, when Paul speaks, sometimes they sound a bit like D or V sounds, like on the podcast, the, not tha. Slight differences. For example, Amber and Paul are on the podcast, duh and the. So I've heard Paul saying on the podcast a little bit more than I do. But really, we're splitting hairs here a little bit, okay? All right then, so what about accommodation theory and an example? Okay, and Nick's original question about the diversity of accents in the UK. Well, I'm going to talk about that more specifically in a moment, talking about this. Maybe some answers as to why we have so many different accents. Accommodation theory might help to explain it, but I'll go into more detail about that first. But first of all, let's check out a funny example of a professional footballer from Liverpool who moved to France to play for Olympique de Marseille Football Club. And he did an interview on television in France, speaking to French journalists. The video went a little bit viral because it was quite funny to see how this guy from Liverpool was speaking to a room full of French journalists. He sort of accommodated his voice so that they could understand him. Let's see. This is Joey Barton. Joey Barton is basically a professional footballer, as I said. Okay, Joey Barton talking to the French press after his first game for Marseille. Let's see if you can notice the way Joey Barton is adapting his English subconsciously to help the French people in the room understand him. As I say, yesterday I make one tackle, and it's not just his accent, it's also his grammar. He's accommodating his grammar, so he's kind of doing foreigner talk, like we heard about earlier in this episode. As I say, yesterday I make one tackle, and all everybody speak about is this tackle. Nobody speaks about a 50-yard pass that kills Bent and causes a red card for him. Nobody talks about the shot that Landro would have been happy to see. You know, he didn't see the ball, never mind have a chance to save it. So, for me, it's important that people speak about the qualities I bring as a footballer. I'm a little bit bored, from the English media, and hopefully the French media have more about it than the English media, and concentrate on stupid little incidents like this. Maybe, can you notice that? Can you hear the way he's sort of sounding a little bit French? Let's check out some examples of that happening. So, yesterday I make one tackle. There you go. Yesterday I make one tackle. Should be yesterday I made one tackle. Now this is not because Joey Barton is stupid or has bad English. He's not stupid at all. He might be a professional footballer, and we sometimes sort of make jokes about footballers not being very intelligent. But Joey Barton is a really clever guy. He's got, a slightly difficult past. I think he grew up in a really rough part of Liverpool, and for example, I think his cousin was sent to prison for murder. Joey Barton himself said that if he hadn't gone into football, he might have ended up in a similar situation. In fact, he did spend some time in prison, and he said that it really made him think, and basically, he's used football to get himself out of that kind of life. I've seen Joey Barton appearing on television and speaking very eloquently and articulately, and he's obviously a very intelligent person. So, it's not a question of his intelligence. It really is, though, a question of him accommodating his English to the people he's talking to. Well, and all everybody speak about is this tackle, right? The only thing all that people are speaking about, and he simplified it to all everybody speak about. All everybody speak about is this tackle. Nobody speaks about a 50-yard pass that kills Bent, and it causes a red card for him. He's almost sounding a bit French. Nobody should talk about the shot that Landreau would have been happy to see. You know, he didn't see the ball. Never. He's not saying he. He's saying you didn't see the ball, which is something you might associate with a French accent. A little bit boring, you know. I can understand. You know, I watched Lille yesterday. They have 10 men. They have 10 men, okay? Not have. But have, he said. For me, you might as well lose 5-0 as 1-0. He's Argentine. I'm English. It's a big difference. Big difference. Okay, I mean, that's just an example of Joey Barton. I tell you what, we can see him talking about that now. Well, you mentioned Le Classique there. Has your French got any better? Okay, has your French got any better? This is Joey Barton on a talk show. Yeah, a little bit. Obviously, we're going to pull this in. We're going to have a look at it. So, all the other presenters on the show are making fun of him and sort of teasing him for his dodgy accent. I'm surprised that people in France speak about this. It's normal in England, and maybe it takes me 1 or 2 games to adapt. For me, it's not a problem. See the way he goes? Which is really French kind of body language. He's kind of shrugging and going as well. And these are sort of bits of body language that we really associate with France. So, he's even acting like a French person. One criticism of the French league is it's a little bit boring, you know. And I cannot. This is kind of like French. You know, I watched Lille yesterday. They have 10 men, and they're happy to lose 1-0. You know, they have 10 men, and for me, you might as well lose 5-0 as 1-0. Perfectly fair, really. Yeah, perfect for the oldies like me. You could get yourself a job on Allo Allo. For the oldies like me, you could get a job on Allo Allo. Allo Allo is a TV show. Well, you're very close to me there, aren't you? You can see me right up in my face. Allo Allo was talking to the camera there, audio people. Allo Allo was a TV show made in the UK, but it was set in Belgium, and all the characters spoke with these terrible French accents. So, he's making fun of him. Now, when that happened, I'm not clearly. What you're trying to do is you're trying to speak in a pattern that the French journalists will understand. I get that. But we, your mates, are onto you straight away. Well, I always remember I was doing a conference full of French journalists. No, foreign journalists, really, in the room. And obviously I'm sitting at the top, and I had my brother and a really good pal of mine, Tags, who were sitting in the back. I had my brother and a really good pal of mine. I had my brother and a really good friend of mine sitting in the back. I had my brother and a really good pal of mine sitting in the back. I had my brother and a really good pal of mine. I had my brother and a really good friend of mine sitting in the back. Hope you have enjoyed the reading. Bye for now.